Welcome, welcome everyone. We see the attendees starting to flood in. I'll give folks a few minutes for everyone to come in. Great. So we'll give it one more minute and then we'll go ahead and kick off.
Yes.
So welcome everyone. My name is Trenae Hawkins and I'm Vice President of the Association of Black Princeton Alumni, or ABPA. We're so excited to present to you today's two-part Black History Month panel, Owning Our Stories, Owning Our Spaces. In just a moment, I'll hand it over to our moderator to introduce today's guests. But first, I wanted to share just a bit about ABPA. ABPA's mission is to strengthen the relationships among Black Princeton alumni and with the broader Princeton University community by providing content, access to resources, and opportunities that allow for deeper connection and engagement. Last year, ABPA launched our Thrive Together campaign, an effort to fully live into our mission, even as we had to adjust to our new reality of connecting remotely. Through Thrive Together, we took our annual award ceremony virtual. We held our first ever virtual 5K race, and we rolled out a series of powerful panels featuring our very own Black alumni tackling some of the most timely issues. We're continuing in the spirit of Thrive Together in 2021, which means we'll roll out even more virtual content, continue to celebrate Princeton's Black alumni in new ways, and create opportunities for you to connect with your fellow alumni. So it's Black History Month, which is my favorite time of year. This year, we were excited to honor 5 ABPA living legends, Black alumni across class years who are making Black history right now. And we're capping off the month with today's incredible panel. If you'd like to stay up to date on ABPA events and connect with others in our Black alumni community, we encourage you to join the ABPA Facebook group and follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram. And I'll drop those links in the chat for everyone. Now I'd like to introduce our moderator, award-winning journalist Melanie Lawson, class of '76. Melanie started as a full-time general assignments reporter at ABC affiliate Channel 13 in Houston, and then went on to become co-anchor of Live at 5 in Channel 13's midday show, Eyewitness News at 11 a.m. Lawson also hosts a weekly community affairs program called Crossroads, focusing on issues and events around Houston. Lawson has had a varied and exhilarating career. She has covered virtually every city, state, and national election during her career. She has traveled to Cuba, Panama, Australia, and across Africa to cover major stories, among other places. And she's won numerous awards for her reporting, including 3 Emmys. There is so much more to say about Melanie, but without further ado, I will welcome her to the floor and hand the mic over. Welcome, Melanie.
Hey, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm Melanie Lawson from Houston, for those of you who just need to know those things. I want to say good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And as we wrap up Black History Month, I am so honored to be a part of this program put on by ABPA. I've been a member and a fan of ABPA for longer than many of you have been alive, so there. I want to make a couple of points before you hear from these extraordinary panelists, and they really are. First of all, something we all know, Black history ain't confined to any single month, much less the shortest one out of the year. As African Americans, we make history every single day, every time we walk into the room. And secondly, history is not confined to those dusty books in Firestone or those familiar names we all learn about as kids, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, John Lewis. Instead, right now, every one of you is kicking in the doors in your profession or even creating a whole new profession. And for the kids that are coming up now, looking at you, watching what you're doing, you represent Black history to them. So I want to just say that quickly. Our first panel is about sharing our stories, and we have such a brilliant cast of storytellers in so many fields. And what's really exciting is there's never been a better time to tell our stories. The saddest part of the George Floyd protest and those for so many other brothers and sisters is that they had to lose their lives in order to become household names, to be known and remembered. But one of the good outcomes, perhaps something many of us didn't even expect, is that there is now a national hunger to hear so many of our stories and no shortage of geniuses to tell them. So it is imperative that we make the most of this very precious time. And with that, I want to go ahead and start off by introducing our panelists, beginning with Bonnie Lehman, class of '84. She represents writers, filmmakers, recording artists, and production companies. So yeah, start getting your resume ready. Her law firm, B2L Entertainment Law, negotiates agreements involving the motion picture, television, multimedia, digital, music, and book publishing industries. And through her consulting firm, Berry Creative Works, she provides strategic advice regarding the development, production, promotion, and distribution of entertainment properties. She is a graduate of Harvard Law School and the Creative Writing for Children and Young Adults MFA program at the Vermont College of Fine Arts. She's also an author, practiced in a minor key, a primer on representing minors in the music industry, achieving success in personal satisfaction in entertainment law, a chapter in the book Inside the Minds, the legal side of entertainment, sports, and media, and soon to be published a middle grade novel. So fascinating career there. That is Bonnie. Roger Mason, class of '08, is an award-winning writer, performer, and educator known for using history's lens to highlight the biases that separate instead of unite us. Mason's playwriting has been seen on Broadway at Circle in the Square, off Broadway at New York Theater Workshop, New Group, American Theater of Actors, Flea Theater, and Access Theater, and regionally at MacArthur Theater, Victory Gardens, Chicago Dramatists, Steep Theater. In other words, a whole lot of theaters all around the country. In honor of the Kilroy's List, the recipient of the Chuck Rowland Pioneer Award and the Hollywood Fringe Festival Encore Producers Award, and a finalist for the Geffen Writers Room, Lark Playwrights Week, and the Screencraft Play Award. Now, Mason's films have been screened at the Outshine Film Festival and the Pan-African Film Festival. So I'm going to stop there because obviously another incredibly talented person here. Naomi Nix is a reporter for Bloomberg News, where she covers corporate influence in politics. Previously, she was the Newark City Hall and education reporter for the Star Ledger, the largest newspaper in New Jersey, as many of us know. In that role, she led the paper's coverage of the city's first mayoral election after Senator Cory Booker took office in Washington. She also worked for the Chicago Tribune and the 74. Her work has appeared as well in the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Atlantic, and Princeton Alumni Weekly. She graduated from Princeton with a bachelor's degree in sociology and a certificate in African American studies. When she's not reporting, she's often engrossed in a good book, geeking out on public radio, and experimenting, not always successfully, she says, with new recipes. We did a lot of that during the pandemic, obviously. Christopher Poindexter is the co-creator, writer, and producer of Brick TV's Brooklynification. I should have asked him how to say that correctly. A digital series that the New York Times describes as sharper than most, well-acted and well-written, understated satire. He is currently working on writing his first feature film, All Her Friends Are White, a romantic comedy to be shot in the summer of 2020. We assume it probably got pushed back. He wrote and produced his first short film in 2011, a scripted comedic look at Black life at Princeton entitled Their eyes were watching gummy bears. We'll have to ask him about that. Chris is a board member of the nonprofit Real Works in Brooklyn, which gives underprivileged young filmmakers one-on-one mentoring with filmmaking professionals. He was the executive producer of Real Works' first feature film, 72 Hours, A Brooklyn Love Story. Chris graduated from Columbia, Law School, and is a transactional media attorney in New York City, in addition to all the other things he does. He's assisted many New York University students and other filmmakers by investing, producing, and providing legal advice to their projects. And I have one last one. Liliana Blaine Cruz is a director from New York City and Miami. Her recent projects include Anatomy of a Suicide for the Atlantic Theater Company, Fei Fu and Her Friends, Girls, which was with the Yale Repertory Theater, Mary Seacole, which was won an Obie Award, Faust, Opera of Omaha, Fabulation or the Re-Education of Undine, Thunder Bodies and Revolt, She Said, Revolt Again, The House That Will Not Stand, and Red Speedo. And I'm going to stop there because there's a long list of wonderful productions that she's been part of. She was recently named a 2018 United States Artist Fellow and a 2020 Lincoln Center Emerging Artist. She is currently the resident director of Lincoln Center Theater. She's a graduate, obviously, of Princeton and received her MFA in directing from the Yale School of Drama. And I believe that is everybody. So I want to say welcome to all of our panelists, and I can't wait to jump right in. So I will. Now that I've introduced you, hopefully we can cover a lot of ground.
I'm sorry, Melanie. Me.
Oh, Felicia, did I
no
leave
problem.
you out? My goodness.
Yeah,
I've got papers and phones. Okay, girl, here we go. Make sure I get this right. Thank you for doing that. Felicia Saunders is a writer and actor best known for her role as, Felicia, you'll help me here. How do I say it? Your role as?
Tabalazo.
All right. In the Star Wars universe, The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker. I'm sure a lot of people are doing this right now. That's fantastic. Born in LA, her early formal education nurtured her interest in the performing arts. She attended Princeton, where she received a BA in East Asian Studies and a certificate in theater arts, and then went on to receive an MFA in acting from the UCLA School of Theater, Film, and Television. Felicia wrote, produced, and starred in a one-woman show called Breathe, a solo experience, which made its streaming debut in December of 2020. Breathe is a form of art activism fusing live performance, cinema, performance art, and artistic swimming in a hybridized narrative that could only be born during these challenging yet galvanizing times. She's currently working on her next one-woman show, which will debut later this year. As a synchronized swimmer for the past 20 years, Felicia was also most recently featured in Beyonce's 2020 visual album, Black is King, and way cool on that as well. So sorry about that, Felicia. I think I've covered everybody now. All right, I'm just going to forge ahead. So the first question we've got, and it's really sort of the meat of what we're doing today as we talk about sharing our stories, is what inspires you to do the work you do? And so many of you have such interesting kind of hybrids of the world as you see it. So I'm going to start off with Bonnie, since that's the first person I see in my square.
Okay, well, I wear two hats. I wear the hat as a children's book writer, and then I wear the hat as an entertainment lawyer. So what inspired me to become an entertainment lawyer is when I was at Princeton, I did not know what I was going to do when I graduated, and I went to law school. And by virtue of being in law school, still trying to figure out somewhere in the creative space, I became an entertainment lawyer, and I started in music. And so this is I'm like you, Melanie, I'm part of that. I'm the OG on this panel. So this was at the very beginning of West Coast hip hop. And basically, what I learned and what has stayed with me is how quickly our people get taken advantage of. This was not anything new in terms of the music business or any other creative place, but it was my introduction. I started off representing people in the music industry, creators, songwriters, and In that industry more so than anything, because the contract itself clearly says, this is a work for hire, we own this, you give us this in order for you to be able to be on this song, to produce this song, to perform this song, it now belongs to us. There's also within that business, there's a way in which people use language to fool people. People who are unsophisticated. They will say to a songwriter, you get the songwriter share, I have the publishing. And, you know, if you're not aware of the business, you don't understand those distinctions. So that the publishing actually belonged to the songwriter initially. It wasn't something that he or she needed to give to someone else. That motivated me throughout my career, which is why I even have the two separate companies, is because not everybody can afford a lawyer, but everybody needs advice and counsel. So Berry Creative Works is really there. So you don't have a deal yet, you don't have a contract, but let me help you understand the business.
Wow.
So that's what inspires me.
And that's why I assume you work with a number of children, but that's why you decided to also write about representing minors, I assume.
Yeah, that was part of it in terms of the representing of minors in the music industry is, again, protecting, and that's both on a musical side as well as a social side. We see what happens to people who go into the entertainment industry very young. Oftentimes, they don't grow up to have successful adult lives. So there's other things to take into account.
All right. Well, the next person I see in my boxes is Naomi. And Naomi, if you would just talk about what inspires you to do the work that you do.
You know, I wanted to be a journalist since I was young. I have a distinct memory being in elementary school, looking at my high school's paper and knowing I wanted to write for it one day. And later I became editor-in-chief of that paper. So I definitely got the bug early. I think if I were to sort of drill down on a common thread for me, it's really about translation, about how other people live and how other people think to a wider audience. I think from a young age, I saw, you know, in my mother's neighborhood, which was a poorer neighborhood, how people lived. And then I would sort of go back to a private school setting and seeing how people lived there and realizing that there were really these different worlds separated by segregation. And part of the privilege of being a journalist, I think, is that you get to break down some of those walls. And you really get to tell stories that, you know, might not otherwise get told. And so I've done that in a lot of different ways. You know, as a local news reporter, that was always very obvious, as you know, because cities are so segregated. Chicago was like that. New York, New Jersey had some of those same issues. Now, as a business reporter, it's really more about asking these powerful companies and institutions, what are the sort of ramifications for their policies and their actions, and how are they affecting sort of everyday people we the public might not necessarily think about. So it's a fun gig. I definitely recommend it if you're looking for a career change.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that. Although it's not where you go to get rich, as you and I both well know. Just an aside, y'all, just an aside. Felicia, if you would take it up next, the question, what inspires you to do what you do?
Yeah, I think it just goes all the way back to when I was a kid. I wanted to be an actor ever since I was in third grade, 8 years old. And, you know, I think of the film and TV and theater, I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but like back then it was just a majority, just white. I looked up to white actors and things like that without even knowing that there were some stories like my own that weren't really relevant back then. And I kind of, we're lucky now that there's more representation on film and TV now and theater. And I want to be a part of that story and add my stories to, you know, what we're seeing now in film and TV. I feel like we're making a lot of strides there. And I just simply just want to inspire. I mean, film and TV and theater educate people who are younger, people who are our age. And I find myself to be an educator in that sense. And I've only recently started writing and doing solo work within this past year with my show, Breathe, which was actually directed by Roger Q. Mason, who's on this panel, who also encouraged me to be comfortable with sharing my voice. And I feel that is so, 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 so important for people to do that in film, TV, and theater, especially with our stories, because we want to be represented and we want kids to see themselves on TV and film, people who look like them. Because I mean, just thinking back, my favorite actor was Jim Carrey. Why wasn't it someone who looked like me, who had a similar background like me? So I want to sort of continue to inspire, and hopefully some kid out there is looking at my show and wanting to do the same thing someday. So basically, it all comes down to just inspiring as well. So that's what inspires me.
And a question that I'll throw at you and then go straight to Roger, since you did such a nice segue. Do you feel as though you're sort of living in a golden age right now for a lot of Black artists and writers and actors?
Honestly, I think it's really, every day I look on Deadline, there's such cool like projects that I want to be a part of as well. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know there's superhero projects out there. There's so many cool projects for people of color now that we really didn't see, honestly, 10, 15 years ago. So I definitely think we're heading there. I mean, Chris is writing a great screenplay. I feel like we're making our strides now. And I mean, just in short, yes, I do think that. And it's exciting.
Yeah, it definitely is. Well, Roger, as I say, that was a perfect introduction to you. I want to ask you, Roger, by the way, in case you all did not know, revealed to us he's experiencing real estate apartheid out in Santa Monica. I think I'm quoting you correctly.
Yes.
So maybe we should ask him about that as well as we talk about spaces. But I want to get right to what inspires you to do what you do, Roger.
Well, what inspires me to do what I do is twofold. Number one, I write work that makes us question where we have been so that we are not complicit in the bias and the lie. Wow. So the history is a tremendous teacher and a tremendous coach of how we can build the future. So if we can somehow tackle the stories that have caused us to be currently oppressed in our present, then we can dismantle those realities and build a much better future. And so part of my aim as a writer and performer is to expose, dismantle, and reimagine the worlds that history has reaped and left at our doorsteps to reckon with. The other part of my mission is inspiring writers and performers like Felicia who are coming up after me, because my work is only as good as those people that I have inspired afterwards. And so for me, it's an intergenerational dialogue. I'm in dialogue with the ages, and I'm also in dialogue with the future. And simultaneously, there's this creative highway that's created with me talking simultaneously past, present, and future, hoping, using the work as a prayer for change.
Wow. Well, and I do want to ask you, as I asked her, whether or not you feel as though you're living in a real moment right now, that there is some kind of a renaissance as far as, art for Blacks.
We are definitely in a renaissance, but like the other renaissance, it is what we make it. And it will last as long as we continue to fight for visibility, for equity, and for fairness. And I think in terms of there being a golden age, any age that you're in where you're telling the truth and advocating to be heard can be a golden age. It's a combination of receiving, blessing, and also endeavoring. And I think the balance between those two things is what makes our age golden, is seeing people striving despite adversity and in partnership with advocacy to move forward. So my short answer is, yes, we're in a golden age, but even if we weren't in one, we damn sure can make it one if we try and work together.
Hello. All right. Thank you so much, Roger. I appreciate that. Liliana, you are up next, and I want to ask the same question. What inspires you to get up every day and do the work you do?
Man, how am I supposed to follow Roger Q. Mason? I gotta say, I'm just so grateful to be part of this conversation with all of you. You are all amazing. And I think what I realized that why I was drawn to theater is that it's the unique space of creating community. It's a unique space where people actually agree to kind of come and sit in the dark together and listen to stories. And that there's something actually really deeply empathetic about that, right? And like in a world where we are, where there is so much violence and oppression, a space where you can actually see and feel and commune becomes sacred, you know? And it's at Princeton where like I discovered that feeling directing for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. And that launched me on this journey of attempting to kind of, one, as Felicia said, like remind people, not even remind people, but to reaffirm and celebrate and uplift Black humanity, you know, in all of its multiplicity and diversity. And also to like engender empathy, to think about histories. Like Mary Seacole was a Jamaican nurse who like was revolutionary in the Crimean War, and like nobody really knows about her in the United States, you know? And so like the ability to, one, educate, but also to create space for love and care and healing is one of the things that like motivates me.
Well, that's fantastic. All right, Chris, you're certainly not the last, you're just the next. So I will ask you the same thing. What inspires you so much to do what you do?
Okay, so listen to all these great answers. I think there's a common thing. Like I've always loved storytelling. All my life, being a little kid, I loved listening to my grandmothers tell stories. My mom's a great story. And growing up, people always thought I was really quiet, but the truth is I just love to listen and just like the rhythm of language and hear how people talk. And I'm from Virginia. I love the way Southern Black people talk and the poetry of the way they speak. And I just love to soak it up. And then I want to tell these stories and I'm from small town Virginia, rural county of 6,000 people. I grew up around on farmed land. And I just grew up around a beautiful Black oasis that's different from everything you see on TV. And there's these incredible stories to be told. And I want the opportunity to tell those stories. I remember vividly walking into the theater and seeing Spike Lee's School Days and just feeling my head explode, having never ever seen anything like that on the big screen and watching these characters I've never seen. And I just wanted it. I'm like, that's the thing I want. That's the thing I want to be a part of. But again, growing up where I was, there's not a lot of opportunities. There weren't film departments at my little public high school, and there wasn't much access to the sort of things that I wanted growing up. And even at Princeton, and I don't know how much to extend exchange, there wasn't a big film scene, even if you had the interest. So I knew I had to go where it was, and that's where after college I went to LA and worked at Disney for a short period of time. Now at the same time, I'm also raised by old school parents who were like, you got to be a doctor or a lawyer, right? And so there was that sort of pressure. And I think I've been very concerned about stability and being able to feed myself and all those things. So when the opportunity came to go to law school, it was the path of least resistance. And there was always this plan like, okay, I'm gonna do this for a little while, but then I'm gonna go back and find my true love. 15 years passed, and I've had a great, wonderful career as a lawyer, doing private equity. I could tell you all about a reverse triangular merger and that sort of thing. But in my heart, there's a story that has to be told, and it will never go away unless I'm actually pursuing this thing. And so I wake up and knowing I have to do my work, but once that's done, I'm going to spend a lot of time daydreaming and writing in my journal and working on that stuff so I can finally break free and commit myself to this other thing.
Yeah, I'm a recovering attorney too, so I understand what you mean. Also Columbia Law School, by the way.
Yeah.
What kinds of stories do you feel most need to be told about our history? And since Roger has kind of redefined our history for us, I'm gonna let you start there. But what kind of stories do you feel just aren't out there yet and we really need to hear and see?
The hidden history. the stories that we don't want ourselves to tell, and the ones that they don't want to hear about us, because they complicate a very neat and tidy order of things. You know, there's such a thing as respectability politics, and there's also such a thing as romance. And those two R's work hand in hand to create a fixed and neat, tidy image of who a particular people can be and are allowed to be in the memories and the cultural imaginations of their own and those who gaze upon them. And so it is the obligation of art, I think, to question, to query, and to dismantle that monolith and open up new possibilities, because then we start to see how complicated and how rich and how human a people can be. It's in that in-between space. You know, I'm coming at this from a queer perspective. I'm looking at it as, how do I queer our relationship to history? How do I exist outside of certain binaries, not just gender binaries, but binaries of respectability, binaries of image? Well, I do that by hugging the place in between, that little dark corner that you said, oh, don't go down there. Why not? That's the type of story I like to tell.
Well, and give me an example. What hidden history have you worked on, or are you aiming for right now?
Well, recently I wrote a piece about Pio Pico, who was an Afro-Mexican politician and landowner in California, who was fighting against not only manifest destiny, but also racism and colorism within Spanish and Mexican colonial culture to become an entrepreneur. And so what I wrote what I called a predator capitalist, a Faustian predator capitalist scream. Not even a play. It's sort of a piece of epic theater that looks at what are the sacrifices that one man makes in order to be somebody in a capitalistic world. And ultimately, the piece says that he leaves materialism because it is in fact the pursuit of that materialism that that is corrupting him. You know, to finish this thought, I was working on the piece and I went to one of the missions where he was active in the 1800s. And there was a Native American woman running the Catholic gift shop. So there's so many ironies there. A Native American woman still selling the iconography of the oppressor who completely decimated her people. And she's still there hawking the wares of that world. And we were saying to her, oh, we're researching Pio Pico. And she said, who's that? And he was a part Native American, Afro-Mexican. And yet his name and his image are not even known to the very people who are selling an image of the oppressor. They don't know him. It's been taken from them. So we have to give it back. And that's one example. There's a couple others and some projects I'm working on that I can't talk about yet, but yeah.
I won't snatch them out of you. And I hate to keep calling on people, I guess, like your second grade teacher, but I'll go one more. Felicia, what do you think? What stories do you think really need to be told out there?
I just immediately think of the solo work that I did on Breathe. That sort of was evolved from my master's thesis, which was basically called Unsung Heroes Activist Project. So when you say like what stories are out there that we should be telling, it's those who are unsung, people who are not known. I mean, to Roger's point, the piece he was speaking about, no one, like, how you hear about these stories and you're like, how do people not know about these things? How do people not know about these people who are doing incredible work out in our community? Breathe was built off of my master's thesis called Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired. And it was based off of the story of Sweet Alice Harris, who basically rebuilt Watts, California after the Watts unrest of 1965. No one knows who she is. Everyone saw my show and was like, who is this woman? And she's literally still there, 85, running her organization, helping the community of Watts right now, doing the real work, like grassroots doing the real work out here. And then people see the show and like, who is this woman? She's incredible. So just bringing light to these stories of people who no one really is speaking about every day. And just making it sort of just making sure people are seeing it across the country. Like I said, she could be out here trying to, you know, be famous or be on social media. You know, she doesn't care about any of that. She's busy trying to get computers for kids in the community who don't have the money to buy computers to take class online. So just lifting up those stories and making sure people see who out here is doing the real work.
Yeah.
So that's a long answer to a short question, but the unsung heroes,
yeah,
really.
And you're absolutely right. Since we're such an oral people, in some way, at least social media helps a little bit, but you're absolutely right about that. Liliana, you want to tackle that? What stories you feel most need to be told about our history?
I agree with both of those. I think that there's, I keep thinking about Susan-Lori Parks' The Death of the Last Black Man in the Whole Entire World, right? And I think about that show so much because she, to Felicia's point, to Roger Q. Mason's point, like there were countless people who didn't even have a chance to write it down, right? To write down their stories, to like acknowledge their existence, right? And so like artists who I think channel those whose voices were never heard, you know what I mean? Who never had a chance to be expressed. Those experiences and those lives having value by existing on stages or existing on screen is a way of reaffirming our love for our ancestors. You know what I mean? It's like, we didn't come from nowhere. We're here, we're alive, we're on these computers because of those who have come before us, you know, and that is so significant. That's so powerful, you know, and I guess I want to celebrate that, you know, and I want to celebrate that on grand scales, you know, and that's the kind of joy of having the space of a space like Lincoln Center, is being able to uplift that. For hopefully lots and lots of people.
Yeah, being able to bring them out. Yeah. Naomi, since you and I are sort of in the same arena, do you feel as though when it comes to telling our Black history stories that we just don't write things down? We are an oral people. We pass it down from, you know, Big Mama to, you know, Aunt Shirley. And we don't sometimes recognize how great the stories are within our own lives and within our own even families and neighborhoods.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes those stories are really quite painful, and actually the process of capturing them and writing them down involves confronting some of our deepest wounds, and that's difficult. You know, I think about, I'm in my family right now, we're sort of doing this video project with my grandmother, trying to sort of get some of her stories while we still can. And I'm noticing even just with her, with someone like a friendly questioner like me, her granddaughter, that some of those things she doesn't always want to talk about because it's so difficult. And so I think though that storytelling and that going through the process can be a healing process in a way that we kind of empower ourselves to look at that history. And certainly with all these esteemed artists here to make the world understand them, and to kind of, you know, draw attention to them can definitely be helpful. But I think, yeah, between the sort of practical busyness, but also the sort of emotional process of capturing those stories, it can be hard. It can be hard in our community.
I'm going to come back to you on that in just a moment, because that's such an incredibly good point. Chris, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I was just thinking, I did a video project very similar with my grandmother when she was about 92. She passed when she was 93. And I also think when I have conversations with my mother about her childhood, like she grew up in Baton Rouge in the 60s, right? But I'm trying to reconcile the difference between the way she tells a story and the way I imagine the story should be told. Because she's a smart, optimistic, nothing can stop me type of person, right? And I tried to say, Mom, but it was so terrible. You went to this segregated school. What about the trauma of that? And she just held her head high, and she has nothing but pride in her youth or whatever. And I've been struggling with how to tell that story and reconcile those two things. Naomi made me think of that, because I can imagine how that conversation would go when you're trying to tease these things out of them and the story that they want to tell.
Yeah, and as I say, you both raise such good points, because you often hear Jewish playwrights or screenwriters talk about the fact that everybody expects them to just talk about the Holocaust, you know.
Right.
In our case, to just talk about, you know, slavery, oppression.
I struggle because I'm a comedic writer, and I'm a joyful, happy person, and I want to make works of joy and happiness. And it feels like a bad time for that right now. It feels like, I don't know if people want to laugh about certain things. I mean, even the work I'm working on now, I'm talking about, I'm currently on the rewrite of a story about a Black couple going to a wedding on a plantation, right? And it's trying to figure out the humor of that, trying to figure out how to tell that story without disrespecting the experience of the people who suffered on that plantation, but also reclaim our joy and how our triumphant spirit, or whatever. It's the struggle that motivates me.
Yeah,
as a happy writer.
I'm just going to say Black people are always funny. So there's always a way to find some joy and some craziness, even in the worst situations. We know how to make it comedic in a lot of ways. Bonnie, I don't think you got a chance to weigh in on this.
I'm just gonna take a little different perspective. I deal with the gatekeepers every day. And what I see in terms of, like, right now, I'm working with clients on a few Oscar campaigns. I think that we, even in telling our own stories, we need to figure out the proper balance between what a friend of mine referred to as Black boy joy, Black girl magic, and education. And what's happening, I feel right now, like primarily in film, is yes, we've got this burgeoning of this amazing interest in our stories coming from the gatekeepers, but they love our trauma stories. And there is such a focus on that, as well as though that is the Black story, and the Black boy joy story, the Black girl magic story is kind of lost unless it is the amazing story. It is you actually were responsible for people going to the moon. And the reality is our stories are so much bigger than that. I was having a conversation with a friend yesterday, and we were trashing La La Land. For those who love La La Land, I apologize. But I was making the point that movie was not, nominated for best picture. And she said, yeah, we'll never see a Black movie like that. And I said, you know what, if you take those elements, Sylvie's Love is actually La La Land. It is a jazz singer, jazz artist trying to break into the business, and a woman trying to break into TV. There's differences, of course. Sylvie's Love is a movie that lots of us have seen and love it, but it's a small movie. We often get stuck with the small movies, and that's when I say, my issue in owning our stories has to do not just with the owning of them, but to actually the owning of the business in such a way that we can uplift and make our stories be on a bigger plane. So it's not like we have to go and discover the small story to find our story.
Wow, that's fantastic. And that leads me to the question I was going to toss at Naomi again, but all of you, what kinds of stumbling blocks, what obstacles have you faced to stymie you from telling those stories, those important stories? And at this point, anybody can jump in. It's a free fall, a free for all.
Gatekeepers. Can I start with that? I mean, it's the main reason I went back to law school, because I was trying to figure out a way to circumvent the gatekeepers. And then New York, I wanted to be closer to like the independent film scene. And I think I am an independent filmmaker. And I like to be able to decide what I want to make and then make it. And it's taken me this long to actually reach that point where I could do that. But the idea that having to sell someone on your stories, even aside from the racial element, that's hard enough in itself. But then when the gatekeepers also don't look like you, that has an extra layer, which could be very, very discouraging.
Anybody else want to
Yeah.
chime in on that?
Honestly, fear of being judged, fear of making other groups of people feel uncomfortable. It took people like Roger to sort of make me see that my voice is valid, that I should not hold back on any experiences that I've had as a Black woman in America. But just that initial fear when you're initially writing, I don't want to say that because someone's going to feel uncomfortable. Or, oh, I don't want to say that because, you know, they're not going to like my show. Who cares? Who cares? At the end of the day, it's our stories. They're going to make people feel uncomfortable. I mean, that's just going to be the nature of some of these things. But I would just say fear was sort of an obstacle for me when I initially wrote my show, and continue to do so. So
Yeah, absolutely. Naomi, did you want to say something about that? You really kind of helped us get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the gatekeeper's point is a good point. There seems to be in the wider world an appetite for certain kinds of stories about Black people, and I think the challenge that we have now is a sort of more nuanced picture of projecting Black life. The way I think about it in the news business, right? I think about like, what are the current stories now, and I think about like the stories in the news about Black women. It's like Kamala Harris breaking this glass barrier. And it's like the women of color who are working in jobs that are being sort of cut and are being hit by COVID at disproportionate rates. And it seems like those tension of like, those are the main news stories about being told about Black women right now. And I don't think we have done a good enough job in sort of telling the full telling of what it means to be a Black person in this country, certainly in the news business. And that's, I think, in my industry in particular, it's because one of the reasons is there's like a race reporter, right? Someone who's supposed to be telling stories about race, and that's their beat. When in fact, it should be questioned that every reporter covering every beat is asking themselves, what are the stories about race and gender I can tell, and how can I tell it in a nuanced way, and not just place the burden on the people designated into those topics. And that's difficult work. But I think the media institutions have to do a better job of making it happen.
Anybody else want to jump in here? I
Yeah.
see my head's nodding. Yeah.
You know, especially in show business, one of the great struggles is the battle to know your self-worth, because it's a business of rejection and perseverance despite it. And so you've got to be a little insane to get up every single day knowing that there are so many different times that you will most likely be told no. And yet you have to have such a bright light of belief in what you're doing and why you're doing it, that you jump off that cliff despite the occupational risks anyway. And if you can somehow find the joy in your work and the purpose behind why you're doing it, it will sustain you past no. Because what you'll eventually find, if you get far enough along in the business, is that the only yeses are the ones that you innovate and try yourself. Not only by yourself, but with the people of like mind and spirit that understand and amplify your work. You have to find your coalition. And I think the struggle for me over the years has been to find and define my way of telling story, and then build that family, creative family of folks that understand things in the ways that we mutually do. And from that place, we go in like gangbusters together, and we don't take no for an answer, because I look at no as an invitation to find yes someplace else.
Yes, preach. I've been looking in the chat room, which, by the way, you all are just firing up. It is on fire right now. And we don't have a lot of questions, but I love this. This is from Debbie Williams. It says, Black excellence so often resides in the everyday. And isn't that the truth when it comes to telling our stories? Anybody else on this topic, or shall I move on?
I just,
Okay, Liliana.
Thing, which is to recognize the Black artists making amazing things right now. Like the fact that a show like Random Acts of Flyness, Insecure, Maddie Diop's film Atlantics, you know what I mean? Jesus and the Black Messiah, you know what I mean? We have so many like amazing, like multidisciplinary things happening in the world. And I think that can be a way to continue that path. And I'm just excited about it. And I just want to say that, like, yes, let's keep going. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you said that, because that was the question we talked about a little bit earlier. Where are we living now in a renaissance? Are we living in a time where it's possible to get those stories out? This sort of leads to the next thing. Who do you see as your most important audience? Who is it that you're really trying to speak to when you do your art? And again, if anybody will just jump in, let me know. Any hands up, or who do you see as your audience? Chris?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this lately. My audience is, because filmmaking takes so long, is 5 years from now, 3 or 4. Like, it's okay if it doesn't hit right away, and it doesn't impact people, but I want people to look back and like, wow, that was prescient to be talking about these things. And so I think I go into projects now thinking, I struggle with the whole pandemic and coronavirus, and a lot of people approach me like, oh, we got to tell pandemic stories. Like, let's figure out a way to tell some pandemic stories, which it didn't appeal to me because it felt so immediate. But I have been thinking a lot about, well, what does post-pandemic life look like and feel like, and start to try to get into those stories. And you mentioned Judas and the Black Messiah, right? Like, I can't think of a movie that was more timely than that movie. And it really required Shaka King thinking 4 or 5 years ago, like looking ahead of the curve, what will we be talking about? And I don't think this movie would have worked 5 years ago. I don't think this movie would have worked in an Obama administration. But this movie certainly works the summer, after the summer of the uprisings, after a Trump presidency. Perfect timing movie. And I've been thinking a lot about how to think and look ahead of the curve that way.
Yeah. I just want to say, because I actually, Judas and the Black Messiah is the movie that I'm working on right now for the Oscar campaign. And the interesting thing about that movie is it took the most powerful Black man who, in terms of the money that he had made, that would be Ryan Coogler, to get this movie made. That movie 5 years ago, whether or not it would have been appropriately seen, it is a reflection of, again, the gatekeeper issue, right? Is that it required Charles King, success at Warner Brothers. It required Ryan Coogler, major success at Warner Brothers. It didn't require, fortunately, what happened this summer, because it was already in motion. It was being shot last year and stuff. Right. But the reality is, and that's part of the thing when, in terms of our building our stories, our ability to own our stories, is the necessity of being able to find other people to create a greater sense of power amongst ourselves. It's like each one rises with everyone else, because that movie would be the little movie on Amazon, if it got made, but for Ryan Coogler having made Black Panther.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So anybody else? I'm going to move on to the next question, but who do you see as your most important audience? Is it just Black folks? Is it everybody? Is it, people who feel a certain way about a certain thing? Who do you see as your most important audience as you're trying to make art that makes a difference?
Okay, I'm going to talk again, but I'm going to put on my other hat now, my hat as a children's book writer. And that one I see as the audience, all children, but primarily African-American children whose lives are not like fraught in, like they're not living every day only thinking about being Black. Right. They're living their lives as children, right? In my stories, I have, they are Black and their experience, it's like for most of us, I'm sure on this panel, their experience are Black. They go to church, they do these certain things that, like when Chris was talking about the sounds of rural Virginia, they live like Black people live culturally, but they're not living in trauma so much that their talk is about what's happening in being Black. I don't think that a lot of young people of any race, I think what they get exposed to, unfortunately, about in Black literature, children's literature, is a Rosa Parks, picture book that teaches them about history. And again, this is not to knock any of that stuff, or another story that tells them about how some Black person had to fight through. And so, Naomi made the point about, it wasn't Naomi, somebody said the point about wanting to see people like themselves in film and TV or whatever. Then I think it's the same thing in terms of books. I want Black children to be seen by other children and to see themselves just as people, not as a representative of a particular race.
That is fantastic. All right. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I want to move on to our last question and ask each of you if you can give me your thoughts, and as concisely as you can. What is your vision for a more just future, especially in the wake of so many things we've seen recently? And how do you see your art playing a role in that? Everybody's thinking?
Well,
Go ahead.
well, I'm watching this and I'm just remarking at the folks on this who are younger than me, because I see the progress, because I feel like they're a little freer than we were coming up or whatever. I talked about professional responsibility, worried about career or whatever. And even as a writer, it used to be super important to me in my early projects to show that I could write white characters, because I wanted white gatekeepers to know I can write for white characters as well, so you don't have to pigeonhole me or something like that. But what I'm admiring is the commitment to their art that I'm seeing, and being honest and being free. And that's the sort of, I want to see more of that. I want to see more kids come through Princeton who can tell their own stories and don't have to worry about the things that I worried about as a storyteller, coming up. And I feel like an old man saying that, but it's true. It's something really remarkable to see.
Hey, Chris, I got shoes older than you, but I definitely appreciate your point. I definitely. Yeah. Anybody else? Bonnie, you called yourself the OG. Would you agree with that when you talk about a vision for a more just future and how you see your art?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that we're becoming more freer, more willing to share exactly what our thoughts are about how to make change, to express where we are in terms of whether it's film, TV, music, books, whatever. I feel like I'm seeing a push through by the creators that was greater than it was when I first came into the business, both as a law professional and as a creative. And I also believe that I'm seeing the gatekeepers are still the gatekeepers, but I think there's a little bit more openness than there was in the past. This recognition that there are stories that they don't know and that they should not tell you how to tell them.
Yeah, absolutely. And you see more Black folks, I guess, who can finance some of those thoughts and ideas. And that's huge. That's very different from where we were. Anybody else? I really want to talk about this vision for a more just future and how art sort of works into that. Ileana, you want to do that? You want to handle that?
You're tapping into this fundamental anxiety existential crisis, which is will art change anything, or am I just living in this privileged position of making art? And I wrestle with that because on the one hand, I believe that art, the existence of seeing yourself on stage or seeing your stories told reaffirms your humanity and reaffirms your humanity for other people. And that changes a cultural dynamic, which to Chris's point and Bonnie's point, the fact of your existence and the work that you have done has allowed this generation to feel free in order to create and make more complicated the many kinds of existences that have happened. So I believe the possibility of that change. And I believe, as Roger pointed out, going into those dark, you know what I mean, corners, or going into those unexplored territories continues to break open the universe. And by breaking open the universe and revealing the multiplicities of those experiences, we begin to accept them. And by accepting them, we begin to create a world that is more understanding. And by creating a world that is more understanding, hopefully more empathetic, and hopefully by having more empathy, we stop people, you know, I don't know, we start to break down the system. You know what I mean? People are like, shut down the police. Like that, like we're saying that, we said that, we screamed it on the streets of New York. You know what I mean? Like there's something to be said about the power of art to kind of influence ways in which we articulate the justice that we're hoping for. And that for me is really powerful and exciting. And I hope gets at some of that existential fear that I don't know if I'm doing anything, but I'm hoping.
No, that's
Lils, you set me up right now. Just
all right, Roger, go for it.
you know, Lils and I have a long history. We won't date ourselves, although you see our class here, so that's done it for us. But we have a many-year history of setting each other up, and then the next one goes on. This happened as someone was talking about BAC, Black Arts Company drama, and how that organization, they missed that organization. And Lils and I were very active in that organization. And when she left that world to me, and I left it to the next generation, and that's how it went. But one of the things that I think the future can hold, that it already is starting to hold, is accountability. I think that social media and the everyday journalist that everyone is becoming, by posting and calling out and saying what they mean and reporting what they've seen. I think all of those things, we'll just ignore that phone because I'm gonna get through this point. All of that stuff is making the world much more transparent and just, because people can no longer hide behind bureaucracy. They now are in a position where they have to be accountable for their actions, and there are real consequences for what they do. And I think art has the unique ability to show us exactly who we are. You know, theater it comes from the Greek word theatron, the seeing place. It is a mirror onto our nature, and it makes us reckon with who we are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if art can be used as a tool of transformation, it can be honed to exact and enact change, because it makes people see themselves. And once they see themselves, they will be forced to make a different choice if their actions or ways of being are egregious and they realize they've got to go someplace else. So we hold the ultimate tool to change it through art.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up, and thank you so much, Roger. But I want both Naomi and Felicia to get at least one last word here. Naomi, I consider what we do a form of art in some ways, and certainly we're about the business of justice and accountability. How do you see your vision for a more just future and art worked into that?
Yeah, I think I'll tie this question and the last question together a little bit, which is I see the audience. I think the ideal scenario is when we can tell our stories like we would tell it to each other, to the broader audience with full authenticity. And I think justice for me is kind of a reflection of that. When we can pursue the professional lives that we want, the personal lives, the financial lives, the intellectual lives that we want, without being held back by any aspect of our identity. And I think my job as a journalist is to point out the ways that that's not happening, to sort of, to rely on a cliche to comfort the afflicted and the comfortable. Yeah. And so that's how I see it.
All right, well, thank you so much. And thanks for speaking for us journalists. Felicia, I'm gonna give you the last word.
I just think I hope my art, in addition to my show Breathe and my future solo works that I'll be creating, will just spark conversation. I mean, when I had my show debut in December, I had different people ask me different questions about some of the experiences I had in the show. I mean, I depict me being called a diversity hire. The reason why I was hired because I was a diversity hire. The reason why I wasn't let into a club in France was because I was Black. There were these different microaggressions that I experienced and also portrayed in the show. And I would have Black people come up to me and say, oh my gosh, that is the exact same thing that happened to me. I never said anything about it. I'm too scared to even share those experiences because it did inflict trauma, but like it's also something that was just very difficult for them to even talk about. And they were able to talk about that with me. And then I had white people come up to me and say, oh, I watched this show with my daughter who's in 7th grade and said, Mom, did those things really happen to her? Do those things happen? And so just creating conversation with not only our Black audiences, but our white audiences who are able to just see that these things are happening. It's not fake. It's not something that's not an experience that people deal with every single day. So I want to be able to spark those conversations, which is in tandem with educating people and having these conversations on a daily basis, because some of these people don't even know that this happens literally every single day to people of color. So yeah, I think Melanie gone?
No, I'm here.
Oh, okay.
I'm
hoping to create those conversations, hopefully make a more just future. So.
Well, thank you. So listen, for all of you. Very hopeful, Chris. I'm like you. It makes me very hopeful to look at our younger versions and to realize they are so much freer and things are in great hands. So I want to thank all of you all, and I hope you'll stick around and listen to the second half of this. But what a great conversation. We're going to just put a little bookmark there, and we're coming back to it, I hope, very soon. So thank you again. And I'm going to ask the powers that be. Yeah, you guys all deserve a clap. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the powers that be at ABPA. Do you want me to just go ahead and just dive right into the next set? Yep, she says on chat. I love chat. And by the way, you guys should go look at it because they have just been blowing up chat, talking about how great you all are. All right. Part 2 is about owning our spaces. So first we were owning our art. Access, ownership, and having a say over the physical spaces in our own neighborhoods has both historical and present-day significance for our communities. From the time we were promised our 40 acres and a mule, Black families have been cheated of their claims to their property and spaces at every turn. Whether you call it redlining or just being shut out of a neighborhood or even losing property because the taxes and insurance keep going up. We've faced all kinds of obstacles to owning our spaces. I don't want to drive out to the suburbs. I want to live right here in the middle of town. And we are, in effect, mowed over. So, in some ways, we also have been shut out of owning our spaces in our heads. The demand that we stay away from certain topics, from certain ideas that are threatening to the majority, or in some ways really taking our space. So the following academics, architects, and tech and real estate professionals are going to talk about these very, very important themes. And I want to go through their bios right now, too, if you will bear with me, so I won't leave anybody else this time around. All right, I want to begin, and Professor, if you are there, I hope you will help me with your name because we didn't get a chance to chat ahead of time. Professor Kianga?
Kianga. Aharde.
Yamarde Taylor. And if you don't mind, from here on in, I'm probably going to just say Professor Taylor, if that's okay. She is an assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton. She's also author of Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Ownership, published by the University of North Carolina Press and longlisted for a National Book Award for nonfiction and a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer, wow, in history. Taylor's book, From hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book back in 2016. She is also editor of How We Get Free, Black Feminism, and the Combahee. Am I saying that wrong too, Professor?
Close enough.
Okay, close enough. River Collective, which won the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ nonfiction in 2018. And my apologies in advance for butchering those names.
No problem.
Dana McKinney. And Dana McKinney, I'm going to have to come back to you for just a second because I can't see your entire resume, but I'm going to come back to that. Then I'm going to go to Kara Michelle, class of 16, who is an urban planner at WXY Studio, where she leads urban design, waterfront revitalization, and community engagement projects. In addition to her work with WXY, Kara is a forefront fellow with the Urban Design Forum, where she is developing a proposal for more equitably integrating workers of color into New York City's plans for energy efficient building retrofits. With a background in studio art and sculpture, she continues to produce visual artwork and writing that highlights the structural inequalities and institutionalized racism perpetuated by the urban design field. She's also a co-founder of Harvard's biennial Black in Design Conference. John Weaver, class of 92, is a technology professional with over 25 years of experience. In 2010, John founded Varsity Software, a consulting company that specializes in helping technology startups launch and grow software products. Prior to starting Varsity Software, he co-founded a company with 3 other Princeton alum called Reunion Technologies. It developed a software platform to help colleges and universities like Princeton, Harvard, and Yale raise money from alumni. Before venturing into the entrepreneurial world, he worked in the music industry as the vice president of information technology at Time Warner's Elektra Records during Sylvia Rhone's presidency of that label. After the company merged with AOL, John served as the vice president and chief information officer at Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LIS, which is a very interesting company. It is a national nonprofit that has invested $20 billion since 1979 to revitalize communities all across the U.S. A native of the Bronx, New York, John received his master's in business administration from the Wharton School. He is married and has 2, we should say, Princeton graduates, or one parents of Adia 21 and John III. And let me get back here just a moment and try to piece together my last bio, and then we can get right into our program. And this is Dana. And Dana, please forgive me because part of yours is cut off, but it looks as though you worked with incarcerated individuals, persons experiencing homelessness, and I just can't see the rest. You graduated in 2011 with an AB in architecture and completed your master's in architecture and urban planning at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. During her time there, Dana helped to establish the inaugural Black in Design Conference, Map the Gap, and the African American Design Nexus. She lives in Culver City, California, where she works for Gary Partners and focuses her work on the LA River Master Plan, Sela Cultural Center, and other river-related projects. So Dana, what I'm leaving out, I hope you will add when we get a chance to chat in just a moment. Now, we have watched such dramatic and really depressing changes in the last few years when it comes to Black-owned. I'm sorry.
There's one more panelist, Cecily King. I don't know if you have that information.
It's happening somehow.
It's okay.
All right, Cicely, why don't you tell me a little bit of something about you, because I don't have you on my program here.
I can introduce myself as we go, but my name is Cecily. I'm class of 2010.
Okay.
I'm a real estate developer. I spent the last 6 years working in Detroit, and I'm originally from New Jersey with roots in Newark, and I can weave more of my background into our discussion.
All right. Well, Cecily, please accept my apologies, but I appreciate you filling in the blanks for me here. As I say, we have watched such really depressing changes over the last few years. And I think between the pandemic and now so many other issues that we are dealing with, we have seen more and more Black homeowners drop off the map. They're not able to hold on to their homes for one reason or another. We've certainly seen renters who own their own spaces in a real sense, many of them evicted as a result of the pandemic and inability to pay for, keep their jobs, even pay for food for their kids and the like. But I want to start off with what inspires each of you to do the work that you do right this minute. And anyone can start, but why don't I start with Professor Taylor?
Okay. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to be here with all of you to talk about these issues. I mean, to make an extremely long story short, I was living in Chicago and working as a tenant advocate in the early aughts, and really decided, and tenant advocate meaning that I went to court with people to try to stall or prevent their eviction. And, the agency that I worked for was on the north side of Chicago. Most of our clients were Black women from the south and west side of Chicago. And through the course of this, I really wanted to understand how Chicago became as segregated as it continues to be. I think that most people have become conditioned to think of segregation as a kind of natural fact of, urban or suburban life. And I really wanted to get into how this happened, how the city took the form that it did. And so I decided during that time that I would, I wanted to go back to school to figure these questions out. And so, out of from that, when I went into graduate school, it sort of coincided with the collapse of the U.S. economy around issues of housing in 2008. And I became very active in local campaigns to stop basically working class people from losing their homes who were facing foreclosure. So, all of these very contemporary issues really led me to these historical questions of how these situations developed. So that's kind of the immediate context for why I wrote the book that I did and continue to be interested in these issues regarding housing.
All right, thank you so much. And of course, we're going to talk even more about what we're seeing as precipitous changes in home ownership. All right, who would like to go next, actually? Kara, you're right there on the top of my line here, so if you'll jump in.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. So again, my name is Kara Michelle, Princeton class of 2014. And I actually came into the field of urban planning from having an arts background. I was studying sculpture at Princeton and art history. And I found that I was drawn more and more often to doing research on subjects related to urban design and urban planning and the history of how our cities were built in the United States, and comparing it to the way that cities were built and became segregated abroad. This was primarily through the channel of understanding how skateboarders use urban spaces and travel through urban spaces, and also, subvert a lot of the pieces of the built environment that I think keep us oppressed in some ways or segregated, and how they were able to kind of triumph over existing systems of transportation that really did encourage ongoing segregated growth in cities and segregated expansion. So when I finished undergrad, I decided maybe this is something that I should seriously study, and ended up studying with Dana McKinney at Harvard. And that's how we ended up co-founding the Black Design Conference together. So that experience, especially being at an institution that has, such a long history at really being in the forefront of shaping urban design and urban planning in this country, and understanding how absent race and class were from the discussion, it really made me seriously consider actually coming into this field as a professional rather than just someone studying it from the perspective of an artist. So I've been working as an urban planner for the past 5 years in Toronto and New York City. And I've always been really driven by being able to work on projects that create more equitable public spaces that more people can access and that actually bring people together. And also just bringing in the stories and the voices of people who are usually not allowed to enter the conversation about how we build affordable housing, where we put parks, what those parks should look like, and how people use them. So that's just a little bit of background on what drives me to want to work in the urban planning and urban design sector.
And I'm curious, I want to hear this from you and Dana, how often you get a chance to see the finished product and people living in your art, if you will. So hopefully we can come back to that conversation. But since you called her out, Dana, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Kara. So Dana, class of 2011. I would also be remiss not to mention my mom, Ivy Thomas McKinney, was class of 77, along with her two sisters.
My girl, of course.
Daphne Thomas Jones, 77, and Evora Thomas, 74. And so I guess my entry into this space is a little bit different. A lot of it was experiential. As a kid, I grew up in a small town in an upper middle class, very white community in Connecticut. But my grandparents, my mom's family, largely lived in Newark, New Jersey. And so we would have Sunday dinners in Newark, and I would kind of see this sort of descent into Newark, where you would go from like these really large single family homes to buildings that were in disrepair, a lot of public housing, homes that were in a historic building fabric, but were not being kept to sort of the standard for that sort of community. And that made a huge impression on me, and kind of just figuring out, well, it's not just these homes that are falling in disrepair or these things that are not being properly maintained. It's also the people that are living and inhabiting these spaces are a different color. They're a different economic strata. And this made a pretty huge impression on me at a young age. At the same time, I was really inspired by like really beautiful places such as churches and like really beautifully designed restaurants, homes of that nature. And I wanted to find a way to marry the discussion of design and economics, of race, of social status, of social factors. And so I went to Princeton to study architecture, but at the same time, I was studying Spanish and urban studies and looking at different sorts of vulnerabilities in space. And then when I went into my graduate work at the GSC at Harvard, I really then started to focus more on homelessness, on incarceration, on aging in place. And it became really important to me because a lot of times within architecture, which is a very sort of elitist profession to be in the first place, there is a disconnect between the elites and everybody else. And there is a disregard for people coming from lower incomes and coming from different racial backgrounds within the pedagogy, within the practice. And so it was really clear for me from the very beginning that it was important to figure out how to marry these notions of social awareness and social welfare system and all these other factors within spaces of beauty. And so that's why I ended up kind of doing a degree both in architecture and one in urban planning, because to be frank with you, architects just don't care for the most part. And so moving forward, I now work for Frank Gehry in Los Angeles. And one of the things it's super important to me is in any project that I touch, I'm kind of the person, the little angel or the devil, depending on how you look at it, sitting on his shoulder saying, well, what about the homeless people in this community? What about our homeless neighbors? Or what about the Black and Brown community that lives here? What about the undocumented residents that are in this community? And so really working with the community members within the design realm, within community engagement, within sort of geospatial mapping. It's much more looking at architecture and design as a holistic process and as a holistic practice, and just try to be more mindful, which is often not the case in our field, unfortunately.
No, that's fascinating. And not only do you have that amazing family history, the three sisters of Princeton who we all adore. But you weren't for the best architect in the world. Good heavens. We'll have to come back to that. Frank Lee. All right, Cecily, since I was so terrible and couldn't find you, I'd love to have you go next and to talk about what inspires you to do the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I come at this conversation with experience in a few different perspectives of the real estate world. I actually started out as a structural engineer, and that was my major at Princeton. And I started my career there. And one of the things that struck me very early on was just how late I was involved in the process. I had actually done an urban studies minor at Princeton, but I didn't really understand what I wanted to make my career until I actually started working and realizing that I was in the real estate industry. And by the time I was involved in a project, I'm so far down the rabbit hole of decisions that had been made when I'm being brought in to design a beam to hold up a roof on a project. I wanted to figure out how to pivot my career in this built environment, which I love, to being on the side of the table where decisions are being made at the very beginning, where a project is happening, who is it being built for, why is it even being built in the first place? And to Dana's point, who is being impacted by it? And for me, the sweet spot that I found actually through a Princeton alum was the real estate development world. And specifically the finance piece, specifically where the money is, specifically where the investment is happening. And oftentimes, I think what inspires me is just simply representation at that point. Because for me, real estate is one of those things that I don't think people think about it as touching their lives every single day in every single way. It's where you live, it's where you work, it's where you go to school. It's pervasive. And I have found the industry to be in no way reflective of the actual makeup of the people that live and operate within real estate. So for me, I think that's like a huge inspiration for me. And in real estate, I've actually, even though a lot of my work has been in the private sector, my current work is in the private sector as a developer and as a consultant, I have been the development director for the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department. So living in the world of making public investment into projects, whether they are affordable housing, market rate housing, making decisions from a policy side, but then also I've been the executive director of a community development corporation. So making decisions on behalf of, or sitting at a table and trying to represent a community. More recently, I'm an adjunct professor at Columbia's Masters in Real Estate Development program. And, you know, I'm definitely one of the few professors of color. I'm definitely one of the few women professors of color, and definitely in the real estate space, thinking on the more the financial and business side, there's not a lot of us. And so even just being that face in front of students who are going into this career and just making them think a little bit differently and challenging their perspective as we're sitting in a classroom having a conversation, that's also inspiration. So for me, representation in all of these little spaces, these different spaces, as we're talking about space that impacts everyone, that's what I love to do.
Wow. Yeah, no, there are no little spaces in this crowd, that is for sure. So thank you so much. Jay, you, I believe, are our last panelist. So if you would, please talk to me about inspiration and why you do what you do.
Absolutely. And Cecily hit the nail on the head when she said having a seat at the table. And that's actually what drives me as well as a scripture, Luke chapter 12, verse 48, which says, to whom much is given, much shall be required. And for me, that is something that has driven my entire career. I was born and raised in the Bronx in New York City, and I have always seen myself as just another poor little kid from around the way in the Bronx. And growing up in the 70s and the 80s in New York, it was a really challenging time. So I always thought back, once I got my career established, that community development would be something that I would want to be a part of. And I had the fortunate opportunity in about 15 years ago to work at the Local Initiative Support Corporation. And LISC is a wonderful organization. If you don't know about it, please Google it. But it's an organization that really focuses on tying together public money and private money with communities in need. And being a native New Yorker, I saw the work that LISC was doing in Harlem specifically around community development. And I had an opportunity there as the vice president and chief information officer to work on a number of housing and development projects with LISC. And that kind of sowed the seed for me to always look at community development as a passion. So once I went to business school and pursued my career as an entrepreneur, I always felt that I had to give back. And for me, that has meant being part of community groups that focus on community development and urban revitalization. So here in Mercer County, I've recently served as the vice chair of the Shiloh Community Development Corporation under the leadership of my pastor, Reverend Darrell Armstrong, pastor of the Shiloh Baptist Church and the chair of the corporation. And what we have focused on is looking at how we could help redevelop some of the properties in Trenton, some of the community institutions that have fallen by the wayside, and also realizing that these issues that we have locally are issues that people have nationally and internationally. So one thing we've also done is developed an international ministry. I've spent some time in Ghana as well as in Liberia, helping with some of the community development projects over there. But for those of you who are interested in community work, I just want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be a full-time job. You can do things on the side, you can volunteer, you can be part of projects. And I think it was Roger earlier in the panel, the previous panel, he said, find your coalition. And I just thought that was such a powerful statement, because I do believe that we as Princetonians, we're smart, we think we're powerful by ourselves as individuals, but our true strength is in numbers. And when we come together and when we find our coalition, like Roger said, that's when we can really make an impact. And so those are the things that inspire me to do the work that I do every day.
Wow, that was fantastic. And it's interesting you talk about a coalition, because I wonder sometimes if it's easier for us as folks of color to get together to buy property, something that we don't necessarily think to do when banks won't give you enormous sums of money. Who are some of the Black leaders from history in this space, since we're talking about Black History Month, that have shaped you or have inspired you? Or did you sort of forge your path on your own? And this time I think I'll start with Cecily.
It's interesting. The first person that actually comes to mind isn't necessarily a Black leader, but I would say similar to actually the conversation from the previous panel about stories is actually my paternal grandmother. So she, I think the end of that story is her retiring as a public teacher in Newark Public Schools. My grandfather owned an auto body shop in Newark. They raised 6 kids in Newark, but they started migrating from Georgia. And I think what I didn't realize until I was older, and I didn't appreciate this story until I was older, was the fact that the house that I have memories of visiting with my cousins, with my brother, that my dad grew up in, was actually the house that she cleaned the floors for originally. And she had saved up money looking for a home for her family. And when the Jewish family that she was working for wanted to sell the house, I don't actually know the details behind it, but she had saved her money and she purchased that house from him. It was a 3-family home that she owned until her death. And she was a landlord for, the majority of her life. And it's not something I appreciated at all until I was an adult. And like Dana said, I would go to my grandmother's house all the time. I slept over there. We would go there for Sunday dinner. I grew up in some ways, a lot of my life in Newark. And I never really had that appreciation for who she was and what she did that early on. So when I think about leaders, it's not, and actually it's not even something that I internalized to the point that I could say it inspired my career, but maybe it's even just DNA that led me here, because it's something that's so intrinsic to who she was. And she doesn't know where I am today and how much that's almost like an expansion of who she was.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. Thank you so much for for sharing that. Dana, do you want to jump in since she kind of gave you a shout out?
Sure. Not someone I know, but somebody I really respect, which would be Paul Williams, who was an architect in Los Angeles and probably had about 3,000 buildings to his name, which is unheard of for any living architect. And he was often referred to as the architect for the stars because he did a lot of homes in the Hollywood Hills and like very glamorous houses. But the sort of running joke about his story was that a lot of people didn't even realize he was Black until they showed up for their first meeting. But he had such a reputation that it completely was beyond him as an individual. He helped to design the big sort of like guard tower in the LAX, which kind of looks like an alien has like descended upon the world. And he just had such vision and such clarity in his ideas and the way that he presented them that it didn't matter that he was a Black man in the 1940s or 1950s and 60s working in this context, which wasn't even close to where we are today. But he had made such an impression with his vision and the way that he was able to tell a story through his designs. Yeah, and it's just amazing to me that he had such an impact. And like, you can look at almost any part of the city of LA and be like, this man has his thumbprint on this. And like all like the Chase banks, for example, he had this really great relationship with a lot of larger companies as well as individual homeowners. And just seeing someone who's able to really forge a path for himself and really shape an entire city, I think is just amazing and something I hope to do one day.
You know what, referring back to the first panel again, that's a story that needs to be told because I've never heard that either. Kara, if you would talk a little bit about the same topic, just who from history in your space had an influence on you and maybe help shape what you wanted to do.
Sure. You know, I really struggled to find historical figures who looked like me doing the same work, especially in urban planning, since it's a relatively new field and, you know, it's a field that like came alive during segregation. I also had a really hard time identifying people who were somewhere in between the art space and the urban planning space until I actually went to the Studio Museum in Harlem while I was in college, and I saw Theaster Gates doing a performance piece where he was actually talking about some of what I interpreted as urban planning projects in Chicago. And so, you know, just because things come together sometimes, while I was in grad school, I saw him one day as a panelist for an architecture class. And I followed him down 4 flights of stairs until I got up the nerve to introduce myself to him. And I was just like, you know what, like you are the reason why I came to urban planning school, because he was really the only person who I saw who was an artist and an urban planner and was making a career out of doing those two things together. And so, you know, that was a really important and formative experience in my career, and he became a great mentor of mine. So I'm very grateful actually for people who are in our, you know, in our present, who are really paving the way. And I just want to give a shout out to Tessa, who's on the call. She is one of the women who I think, you know, even though she's very, very close to me and Dana in age, and we graduated in very quick succession, she really paved the way for us, I think, coming through Princeton into Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where there were, you know, few enough Black students to count on one hand, and actually started forging a coalition of Black students that I think really made my experience, and I think Dana's experience too, not to speak for her, truly worthwhile.
Yeah, Tessa's pretty amazing. You want to tackle it again? I know you mentioned a couple of names when you spoke before, but anyone specifically that you look to from history or even from current history?
Oh, me still?
Oh, I thought I was talking to Jay. Maybe I.
Okay.
Sorry about that, but you were great. I could do you twice. Go ahead.
And one thing Kara mentioned, though, is having mentors and finding mentors, I think, is important. And I had the opportunity when I was in high school to serve on Mayor David Dinkins' Youth Advisory Committee. David Dinkins was the first Black mayor of New York City. And I'll always remember just having that opportunity as a teenager to sit in the room with him and the movers and shakers of City Hall as they were planning and organizing and thinking about how to redevelop New York City. And that's always stuck with me. It planted a seed for making sure that as I got older, I would mentor other people and open as many doors as I could for younger people. And I think it's important for anyone on this video call to make sure you go above and beyond to extend your network and open your doors to younger people, whether they're in high school or even undergraduates at Princeton. And I'm fortunate in the sense that I live and work in the Princeton area. I live in Lawrenceville, the town right over from Princeton. And so I'm always back on campus, and I try to mentor and help as many students as possible. And I think it's important that we figure out a way to build our network so that people who look for support, look for advice, look for guidance will have resources available to them as they do this important work. One of the reasons it's called community development is that you can't do it by yourself, right? You need a community of people to work with you to help do the development work.
Professor Taylor, I'd like to not only ask you this question, but kind of leap into the next topic. I do want to ask you if you feel there were some Black leaders from history in this space that shaped you. But I also want to talk a little bit about what you've written about, and that is losing home ownership and why that has become such a critical issue for people in our community. I wonder if you would mind addressing both of those issues.
Yeah, I mean, the first, I mean, I guess those things are probably connected. You know, on a personal level, you know, my father is the founding director of urban studies at the University of Buffalo and is an urban planner. And, you know, I think that had no influence on me as a young person. It was only in graduate school that I actually became familiar with his work. And it has, you know, turned out that there's a lot of overlap in the work that we do. And, you know, now I think of him as a kind of intellectual collaborator. We just did a talk together for the first time at Penn, University of Pennsylvania, a few weeks ago. And, you know, it's interesting the way that our ideas and work have actually overlapped, even though I was very resistant to engaging with any of his work earlier. I think as a historian, you know, two people that stand out to me in particular are Du Bois and King, and that is really about their ability to understand and articulate racial segregation as a form of economic exploitation in particular, because I think that I said earlier that there is a tendency to see the segregated metropolitan space as almost natural because it has persisted for so long. But it's part of that, seeing it as natural, as a feature of nature, is to think that that it is simply an expression of human desire, that, you know, we live among who we want to live, and, you know, we choose our neighbors based on personal likes and dislikes, and, you know, all these things are driven by desire. And I think, you know, I was just reading actually a few days ago an essay that Du Bois wrote in 1925 about the racket of real estate and the the deliberate construction of this notion that Black people have a deleterious impact on property values is really a way to control the market. And so that this isn't just a feature of human desire, it's not a feature of nature, it is a feature of market influences. And in doing so, it really exposes the lie that the market is a neutral space where only issues of supply and demand are dictating the housing, particularly in housing, that is available. And that Du Bois was discussing this and talking about this in 1925, I think speaks to the longevity of the entwinement of racism and real estate in this country that is a problem that continues to present itself when our federal government continues to hinge its solutions to the perpetual housing crisis to the private sector. Real estate is an industry that for the entirety of its existence in the 20th century has always had racial discrimination as a best practice at the core of its practice. And so we have to think about what it means to continue to seek out the private sector when solving the particular way that housing crises present themselves in Black communities. And then the other person is King, really Martin Luther King, for similar reasons. I think that when we talk about the 60s, housing becomes one of many sort of issues of discrimination that are all lumped together. And we can miss how the lack of not just affordable, but good housing available to Black families was in and of itself a catalyst for the social movements, but also the social explosions of the 1960s, when the Kerner Commission, a commission to investigate the causes of the riots during that period from 1964 to 1968, went to every city where riots happened and interviewed people. The top 3 reasons that were listed were police brutality, unemployment, and substandard housing. And so the impact of not having a stable, affordable place to live has a reverberating impact. And then again, locating that in the as a feature of exploitation, not as a feature again of human desire, but that people are actually enriching themselves on limiting the housing choices of African Americans. And so I think when we talk about how that relates to the home ownership, the perpetual dearth of opportunities for home ownership for Black people, we can see some of those same dynamics at root. Andre Perry, who has written a report for the Brookings Institute, he's a fellow at the Brookings Institute, about the way that Black properties are devalued. Through his work, put a number on it that Black housing, Black homes are devalued to the tune of $150 billion compared to homes owned by white people. So similar houses just in Black majority neighborhoods compared to white majority neighborhoods. And again, this is a feature of market manipulation. And so I think for me, that is part of what is important in these discussions is not just the wealth gap and that, which is, you can put those 2 numbers together to understand the wealth gap, but understanding that racism in real estate, segregation in real estate exists because it is profitable. It exists because other people are enriching themselves because of the situation. And we can disabuse ourselves that this is just, people want different neighbors and people have different ideas about what a good neighborhood and a bad neighborhood are. These are all socially constructed ideas that are intended to tip the market in favor of some and tip it against the favor of others.
Professor, wow, that was laying some knowledge on us, and I can see folks agreeing with that. And in particular, it's interesting how those homes that are devalued in a Black neighborhood suddenly achieve great value when whites begin moving into that neighborhood.
Exactly.
That is a very interesting piece here. Well, believe it or not, we are sort of getting close to the end here. So I want to throw out this question before we have a chance to wrap it all up. What is your vision for a more just future, and how do you see your work really playing a role in creating that more just future? And I'd really also like to hear from those of you who are kind of inside the belly of the beast, hoping to be able to change some of those things. So I'll start this time around with Cecily.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate your perspective, Professor Taylor. I have chosen to really focus my profession as a real estate developer in housing, because I think, especially as you know, more recently, as we've seen over the last year, when it came to housing insecurity as a result of COVID, for example, it put into the media a situation that exists, that's pervasive throughout our country. I think one of the things, there's 2 points I want to make. One, I wish I could attribute this to the right person, but I was in a discussion earlier probably the end of last year, where someone referred to the affordable housing space as the plantation industry. And it caught everyone on the call off guard, but the way he described why he meant what he said was so impactful. And I can't honestly get that thought out of my head. I think the quick summary is, I think affordable housing is one of those things where we as the US like to pretend it's one of the things that we treat as if we're a socialist country, and yet we come at it from the perspective of capitalism. And it's this place where someone's business or business person and someone's home intersect. And oftentimes the people even if you just go to a data set, the number of the people who occupy units that are funded with HUD dollars, even if they're just affordable, they're not necessarily public, are disproportionately Black and brown people. And yet the developers of those units are disproportionately white. And so there is this massive disconnect between the people that are building and the people that are being built for.
All right, before I go to the next person, I do want to thank Professor Taylor. She had to leave early for another event. So we want to thank her for dropping all that wisdom on us, because that was really pretty powerful stuff. I did see a couple of mentions in chat, Jay, by the way, about LISC. And I didn't know if you wanted to mention that as one of those visions for a more just future. But I have to say that that whole phraseology about affordable housing, you're absolutely right. It does, in so many cases, just sound like the new version of a ghetto, you know. All right, Jay, you want to tackle that, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So for me, when I think about the ideal future, it really means involvement. And I can't emphasize enough, whether or not you are in the urban planning space, or you're an architect or an engineer full-time, or if you have another job in another career industry, like myself. I'm a software developer by day, but I have a passion for community development. So you can work in any industry and still be in the community development space. And so if I had to think about what the ideal future looks like, it means getting involved somehow, some way with an organization like LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation. I put that in the chat. You can Google them, find out more about their local branches, or even your local community development organization. Cecily mentioned she used to be part of a community development group. They are everywhere, and they're the ones who have the boots on the ground, who are doing the work in your local communities to rebuild housing, to figure out entrepreneurial opportunities for the local residents. And if you can get involved either by giving money or your time, that's what's going to make a difference. That's what's going to change the reality for people on the ground. And it also means spreading information and making sure people know about what's happening in this space. So I'd like to just leave everyone with just a couple of key dates that are important, since the pandemic is here and we're still dealing with all the repercussions. There are a number of key dates coming up for people who are struggling financially. So for example, if you are a renter, the federal moratorium on evictions actually expires on March 31st of 2021, which means that after that date, unless anything changes, you can be evicted from your apartment if you're renting. Here in New Jersey, the governor actually signed an order which extends that date until May 19th. But these are key dates for people who are currently renting. So you can lobby your Congress people, you can try to get these dates pushed out, because it will impact, unfortunately, a lot of Black and brown families if these moratoriums, evictions, actually go through. And if you're a homeowner, there are actually a number of dates as well that you should be aware of. For example, June 30th is the last day that you cannot be foreclosed upon. So if you have a mortgage which is backed by Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, you're currently able to push your foreclosure up until the end of June. But beyond that date, foreclosures can start happening again. So for me, it's about spreading information, spreading knowledge, making sure that everyone in your community knows about these issues, these dates. Even if you yourself might not be at risk for losing your apartment, I'm sure given your family or your network, you might know people who might be at risk. So, that key future for me looks like all of us getting involved somehow, some way, sharing information, spreading knowledge.
Yeah, and that was some really important information. Hopefully, ABPA can put that up on their website or Facebook page, so it is information we can access. And again, it's the whole problem of in our community not being able to get ahead. You finally got a house, and then suddenly a pandemic hits, and you're in danger of losing that house. Or you finally got a nice apartment with a little job you have, and then your job goes away, and you don't know if you can keep your apartment and take care of your kids. So I don't mean to express a lot of gloom and doom, but we all know when the rest of the country gets a cold, we get pneumonia, or in this case, we get COVID. I want to go on to Kara. Why don't you step in, if you would, and talk a little bit about your vision for a more just future and how you can help create that in the very important position you're in.
Yeah. I think the moments when I'm most inspired and hopeful about a more just future, and the moments when I kind of get an inkling of what that might look like, are actually when I'm working with young people, teenagers, especially high school students today. I am fortunate enough to get a lot of opportunities especially with my projects in New York City, and even some past projects in Toronto and Cleveland, Ohio, to work with high school students. And it is just so incredible to understand how ready these kids are to fight for a more just world, because they grew up really understanding what it looks like to be economically disenfranchised. I think seeing a lot of things that even millennials, I think we're a little bit sheltered from. So as an example, I was just talking to a group of students on the Rockaways who are learning about environmental science and protecting their shoreline. And the conversation, we went from talking about like the 10 tenets for environmental resilience to talking about how some of the kids in the group had convinced their parents, or actually gone in and signed their parents up to vote in the 2020 election. Kids talking about the impact of climate justice and climate racism. So they have this deep understanding of terminology and issues that have disenfranchised us in so many ways at the age of 16, 17, that I don't think I even understood until I was in graduate school. So I think that the future really looks like the next generation of young people understanding that they actually do have access to the tools to make changes when it comes to impacting the future of the environment, when it comes to impacting the future of built space, and when it comes to impacting the future of how the country's finances are spent, and participating politically. So I want a large part of my work to continue really focusing on teaching, whether it's in a professional sense or in a more academic sense, because I think people are at a loss for the tools that can really change their neighborhoods. And you know, in a lot of the communities I've worked in, I notice who comes out to the public meetings, who can throw a wrench in our plans, who can lobby. And it's often, you know, wealthier, whiter, really well-educated people who they've figured out how to play the system and they figured out how to make the system work for them. But if we have a coalition of young people who are increasingly multicultural and know how to play the system and know what the tools are and know how to come together to make a difference rather than just going out for themselves, I think I'm really hopeful for what that future might look like.
All right, and that is a good place to sort of put us all, because I do worry about the fact that so many of our people are losing their space. That is a big concern. Dana, I'm going to give you the last word. So if you would just talk a little bit about your vision for the future, and especially since you're there at the really the top of the mountain, and how you see your work really creating a different kind of appearance.
Yeah. Well, for me, I think I see a future in which there's housing equity and true housing equity and justice. I think far too often in the Black community, there isn't enough home ownership. And I know affordable housing is key in terms of just creating access, but it can't just be focused on renter occupied affordable housing. It really there needs to be, I think, a national shift to owner occupied affordable housing, because that's a way that people can really build equity, right? There's $1 for every white person compared to 7 cents for every, or 6 cents for every Black household. And that is largely because of home ownership and the equity that you build. And in consideration of just home ownership, one of the things that, like in my space where we're doing a lot of, you can say sometimes frivolous architecture and big concert halls or park projects, things of that nature, is we don't look enough at the implications of large scale projects on the surrounding communities. And so in the work that we're doing along the LA River, one of the things we're doing is looking at how there is a 20% increase in housing value whenever you have any major infrastructural improvement. And so that's within about a half-mile radius of the site.
It takes so much bravery, right?
I think, hello, you guys hear me?
Yeah, I think she muted herself.
Okay. Okay, I'm sorry about that. But basically, yeah, it just, there is a linkage, there's a fundamental linkage between any sort of major infrastructural or arts or community center improvement to the neighborhood surrounding it. And I think we're blind if we don't consider what this does to communities like our own. And so for me, it is just a mindful and a thoughtful sort of look at both the design as well as the planning as well as the housing. You have to really look holistically, and I think we owe all communities that we look towards those that are most vulnerable and the most at risk to displacement, or who are at the most risk to other sorts of factors that might fall into place. And so I just think it's a critical thing that we have to look at, is who's going to be affected, and to be designing spaces and designing cities and communities for those people first, and everything else will fall in line. And I'm enthusiastic for this.
Yeah, and you think it's possible for more of us to be able to own our own homes, even given the financial inequality you talk about.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a lot of federal or state programs for owner-occupied housing, but I think through land banking or through some sort of creative financing mechanisms, I do think there is a potentiality to do this. And like I know, like in Anacostia in Washington, D.C., there's been a really significant effort to do land banking there, in which people can buy homes at a hugely discounted price, but then when they sell that, the equity that they build, they get to take 25%, and 75% goes back into the land bank. And it becomes a sort of reciprocity that's established between generations of people who live in that community. And so I just think that we have to think more creatively. We have to push back on the federal and state governments to actually look at bigger financing efforts. And we just have to be more thoughtful and have more foresight into how we're doing these projects and making them work. Because I think we're at a point when we have to do this at this point. Like, there's too much inequity. There's too many disjunctures between the different societies and sectors and communities, that you have to put a better foot forward.
You know what? It always breaks my heart when we have to wrap these up, just as we're getting to where you really want to talk about more things. But I have to thank you all for such a thoughtful and really informative panel. I loved hearing not only about what you're doing and where you're headed, but also, just about how we're envisioning our cities as we proceed, because we're always going to be there. The future does include us. I don't care what anybody says. And we're going to all have to have a place where we can own our spaces. So thank you so much for this and for allowing me to be a very small part of it. And if you will, some of you should check the chat because there's some pretty valuable information there, which I think we're going to transfer to the ABPA website and their Facebook page. So thanks you guys so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Tessa, who is going to sign us off. Tessa, sorry we ran a little bit long, but when it's juicy, you just can't stop it.
Yes, it was so juicy. It was so beautiful. Thank you so much, Melanie. You are incredible. You have interviewed everyone from Maya Angelou to Beyonce to Denzel Washington, and these panels today are just of the same caliber. So thank you so much for being here to conduct this with such grace and such love. And I want to just send appreciation to all of our panelists from the first part with our stories that allowed us to deepen our understanding of ways in which that we can continue the legacy of so many of those that came before us, to make sure that these stories are told and to make sure that we are operating in a space where we can lift up the voices of others. And what an amazing final panel. So much love to Dana and Kara and to Cicely and to Jay, and of course to Professor Taylor, even though she had to go, but such beautiful ideas around how do we imagine a future in which we have the equality and justice and liberation and freedom that we so deserve. And so thank you for bringing us into that space. I hope that people took out some nuggets that allow you to think about these issues and be a better advocate and a better ally tomorrow than you were today. In whatever field you are, I think what today really showed is that no matter what your profession is, we can all do our parts, even if you're the only one or your voice shakes or your palms sweat, to understand how do we lift up these ideas and make sure that we are part of the change, that we're not operating in spaces of neutrality, but every day fighting to make sure that the legacy of all months, but especially this month, is lifted up, and to make the angels on our shoulders sing and our ancestors proud. I want for folks that are not aware, please follow the ABPA, has an Instagram, has a LinkedIn. So feel free to, I think Trinae, who runs all that, she's amazing. I think she's putting it in the chat right now, so you can follow along there. And then I loved what Kara said about, because I also feel like the most inspiring moments, most inspiring people now in my life are young folks, and understanding how that thank you, love. How to support and uplift and really deepen our connection to that generation. And so we're having an event so there are 12 Black student groups that reached out to the ABPA a couple of weeks ago that said we would love to have a night with Black alumni in order to make these deep connections after a year that's been so wild for everyone. So this will be March 17th, 8 to 9:30 p.m. And it's gonna start by a beautiful student keynote. There's gonna be a little bit of a Jeopardy trivia game between alumni and students. That'll be fun. But the heart of the event is really to have breakouts for all the student groups that we're all in, and to make some really deep and meaningful connections to help folks with opportunities and just to build relationships and build communities. So if folks are available, so the link is here, we'll send it out in addition to the recording of today, if anybody wants to get involved. But it should be a really beautiful night. It should be really memorable. I've been on calls with the students for the last couple of weeks, and they are just so creative. They're so excited. They're really inspired. I know some of them are on the call today. So it's always just so cool to see the next generation of folks that are always exceeding expectations. Like when I met Kara and Dana, I'm like, anything that we did at school. Like you have just gone far and beyond. So thank you so much to everyone. Thank you for being here. And I think we'll follow up via email with all of the information that we're sharing here in the chat. And just want to thank so much the panelists. This was so rich. I've left with a lot of incredible things to take away, to reflect on, and to incorporate and to apply. And Melanie, you have led us so perfectly. So appreciate your spirit. Sending love to you and anyone else in Texas. Melanie is in Houston right now. So thank you for the work that you're doing. Thank you for welcoming so warmly our Vice President and President yesterday to your city, and being on all those news channels. And I just want to, wish everyone a happy and safe weekend.
Yeah, it was my honor, and thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, everybody.
You too.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.